I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the Cultural Analytics Speaker Series on behalf of the iSchool and the Berkeley Institute for Data Science / AI Futures Lab. We have an ongoing series that will be continuing into the future with leading scholars and new voices in the space of cultural analytics, the data-driven analysis of cultural phenomena. Today's talk is being presented by Melanie Walsh, an assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Information. She had research interests both in data science, digital humanities, cultural analytics, which is why you're here, contemporary literature and library and information science. She has a PhD in English from Washington University in St. Louis, and then did a postdoc in the iSchool at Cornell University, high above Cayuga's waters, I believe. So we're going to let Melanie talk, and then we'll hold all of the questions in, for the end. Oh, I was just about to get to that. The other thing that you should know is that we are recording this, and it may be published on the BID's website under the Cultural Analytics banner. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Walsh.
Everyone, thank you so much for having me. Big thank you to Tim and to Lily for helping to coordinate my visit and everybody else who was involved. I'm really happy to be here. I got to hear the Campanile doing its song. That was pretty cool. Okay, before I begin, I want to ask a quick question of the room. How many of you, by show of hands, have used an AI model to generate some kind of fiction or story? Okay, I don't know if it's fully half the room, but maybe close to half the room. So I'm going to be talking to you today about some people who are generating a lot of fiction with AI models. So let's move to an even bigger question. What kind of fiction will people read in the future? A future that includes AI models that can read and write themselves. To date, much of the conversation about AI and literature has focused not on readers and reading, but on writers and writing, and for good reason. The developments in the space are very interesting and important. So there are some literary authors like Sheila Heti and Ben Lerner who have experimented with machine-generated prose in published works. And there are other more commercial writers writing on platforms like Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing, who are reportedly incorporating LLMs into their work to write and sell more books faster. But what about readers? Are readers using AI to generate fiction too? Thanks to a unique public data set called WildChat, we can say definitively yes, and we can show that the fiction itself is pretty wild. So in this talk, I'm going to be sharing some insights from a collaborative analysis that I've conducted with my PhD student, Neil Gupta, as well as with Maria Antoniak, who's an assistant professor in computer science at CU Boulder. And some of this work is going to appear in a special issue of the journal Modern Fiction Studies, and some of this work is ongoing. So in our analysis so far, we have analyzed more than 500,000 real-world English language ChatGPT conversations and found that users are not only generating fiction, they're generating a lot of fiction. More than a third of the conversations contain some form of fiction generation. This includes original stories and role play, world building and movie and TV scripts, plus lots and lots of fan fiction and erotica. While seemingly a departure from the history of human-authored literature, I argue that this LLM-generated fiction instead represents a clear extension of trajectories charted by critics like Mark McGurl, Carl Berglund, Sarah Brouillette, in which readers increasingly prize generic forms, repetition, and immediacy, and where, especially under the conditions of late-stage capitalism, the reader is usurping the authority of the author as a customer and consumer and kind of can demand what they want more. The WildChat fiction allows us to speculate about several consequential questions at an inflection point in the history of storytelling and entertainment. How will the experience of reading and writing fiction change? How will LLMs shape or disrupt traditional modes of literary publishing? Where does AI fit into broader literary and cultural history? So before I get to these big, juicy questions, let's talk about the data. What is WildChat and why was it created? So hundreds of millions of people are now using AI tools every day, but how exactly they're using them remains something of a mystery, at least outside the corporation. So some of the big AI companies have recognized that releasing information about how AI tools are used is really important. And so some of these companies have begun to do a little bit of this work. So Anthropic has released an analysis of 1 million conversations with Claude, but they purposely try to preserve user privacy. So they do it at a very high level, and they cluster the conversations into topics, which you can see here. And this is interesting, but rather unsatisfying for our purposes. For example, it's hard to know what exactly goes into content creation and communication. Just last month, OpenAI released a similar analysis of a random sample of 1 million ChatGPT conversations. And it, again, remains at a pretty high level, though they go a little bit more granular. And it's interesting that writing is one of the top 3 most common conversation topics that they identify, and write fiction is its own subcategory. But there are reasons that we might be a little skeptical about the representation of AI use that these companies are putting out. So for one thing, erotica, pornographic material, it doesn't show up in either of these analyses, and we know that people are using AI tools for these purposes. Just last week, Sam Altman announced that ChatGPT is going to be allowing erotica for verified adults. That suggests they are seeing a demand for erotica. So the fact that it's not showing up here, those words don't come up anywhere in those papers, makes us, have questions about the way it's being represented, what's being obscured. And more broadly, we can't, replicate these studies that they've done. We can't look at the data in any more detail. So the point is that when it comes to understanding how people are actually using AI tools, there is a big power imbalance between the corporations and everybody else. So this imbalance has motivated researchers to begin developing their own LLM user conversation datasets. There are now several, but WildChat is arguably the best. So from April 2023 to May 2024, researchers at the Allen Institute for AI hosted 2 free public-facing chatbots on a website called Hugging Face Spaces. This is a community for sharing machine learning models and datasets. One chatbot was powered by GPT-3 and the other was powered by GPT-4. There is now a freely available version of GPT-5 that you could go and try yourself. So data collection is ongoing, but there's only been one data set that's actually been released, which is the one that we focus on. So users can visit this site, they can chat with the models and explore their capabilities without creating an OpenAI account and without paying for an OpenAI account. So these are some of the incentives for users. And in exchange, they're asked to consent twice to having their conversations be collected and shared for research. So the second pop-up is the clearest. By clicking OK, I agree that my data may be published or shared. So those who click accept were included in the WildChat dataset, which contains more than 1 million conversations in more than a dozen languages, about half of which are in English. Though the pop-up makes clear that a user's data may be published and shared, ethical questions and quandaries remain. We might wonder how many of these users actually read the agreement or fully understood the implications of their decision. Many users shared personal or sensitive information in their chats despite agreeing to share them publicly. And there's been some work to remove the personally identifiable information in this data set, which I could talk more about in the Q&A. And on the note of data, it's also worth mentioning that one of the fiercest controversies around AI models revolves around their training data, especially the use of copyrighted works like novels. No consideration of AI fiction or its future is complete without considering the human creators who enabled this development and who may be harmed by it. So now we have access through WildChat to over 1 million real-world conversations, more than 500,000 English language conversations. But how do we find the fiction? How do we estimate how much of this is related to fiction? Literary scholars know, maybe better than almost anyone else, that what counts as fiction is not a trivial question. This question gets even trickier at scale. That is when the goal is to make this determination not just for one text, but for hundreds of thousands. You need a certain amount of nuance, something that you can't just get from searching for simple keywords like story or script. So we turn to the use of an LLM as a classifier. Generative models are remarkably good at reading and classifying texts, and they can do so relatively quickly, even with no or very few examples, even on very large collections. So in our approach, we show the model, specifically GPT-4o mini, each WildChat conversation, and we ask whether the user's prompt contains a request for fiction. So we provide a detailed explanation, specifying that fiction can be any content that is imaginative, speculative, or not grounded in real-world facts. We provide one example input and a desired output, providing a real WildChat user prompt and the correct answer according to our schema. So in our example, a user asks ChatGPT to imagine an alternate scenario for the Game of Thrones character Arya Stark, saying, what if Arya was a lady? I'm a little confused by this because I think Arya is a lady in this universe, but it's being framed as if it's an alternate scenario. And we see many users employ this what if template to generate fan fiction or to brainstorm different kinds of fictional premises. And we purposely choose an example that is less straightforward than a write me a story about X template. We see that a lot in WildChat, but we wanted to expand beyond only that very narrow understanding of fiction. So we run this classification on all 573,000 English language conversations, an operation that costs almost $1,000 and took multiple days. How do we know we can trust the model? So we manually read a random sample of 200 conversations and labeled whether they contained requests for fiction according to our own subjective judgment. We find that the model achieved 100% precision, meaning that it never made a wrong guess. Every time it labeled the conversation fiction, we did too. It scored 98% in recall, meaning that it missed a few examples, and these were often sort of blurry lines between fiction and nonfiction, like a RPG character profile for Pamela Anderson, who's a real person. So we think, if anything, we might actually be underestimating the amount of fiction in WildChat. So based on this classification, what slice of LLM use is devoted to fiction generation? We find that more than a third is, at least among WildChat users. About 34% of all the conversations contain requests for fiction, and this is a proportion that aligns with findings from Antoniak et al., who also analyzed the WildChat dataset. While the fraction of fiction is large, a small number of power users make up large amounts of the corpus. Something like 2% of users within the fiction subset are responsible for over 70% of the conversations. And it may be even fewer users than that. There are some complications with determining unique users in this data set, which I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A. but it might be even fewer power users. When we account for the influence of prolific users, and we randomly sampled just one conversation for every user, the amount of fiction drops to 10%. But that's still a large proportion of fiction, and it raises questions about WildChat's representativeness. Are fiction-hungry LLM users unique to this community, or do they reflect broader patterns? We can't answer this question definitively, but this data provides evidence of highly engaged, real-world fiction generation practices. And it helps us speculate about the affordances and limitations of language models for cultural production. So what kinds of fiction are users actually generating and how? The WildChat data reveals a staggering variety of both prompt strategies and types of fiction, though erotic content and fan fiction are clear through lines. And this is a finding that may not be surprising to anyone who's familiar with 50 Shades of Grey or the internet. We plan to release this subset of fiction conversation and prompts that we've identified to the research community. And we think this data is really important for NLP and cultural analytics research, especially research that is testing and evaluating the quality of creative LLM outputs. Because basically we see a mismatch in how LLMs are being evaluated and how LLMs are actually being used for creative purposes. So I'll just say a little bit about that. First, we see a big difference in the length and level of detail used in prompts. So I'm implicating some of my own prior work here that I've done about poetry. So you can see, let's see if I've got my mouse. In some of our prior work, we said, write a poem about the subject of X in the following form or style, Y. And in other prior work, you see something like, invent a synopsis for a movie entitled movie title. Or write a New Yorker style story given the plot below, and then they give them a one-sentence summary of a real New Yorker story. But we find that WildChat users often have much longer and more involved prompts. So the median prompt length that we find in WildChat is 40 words. And there are a lot of prompts that are much longer than that. And I'll show you some actual examples in a couple of minutes. But the other thing that's worth noting that we see in the prompts is that there's a real desire for generic forms and tropes, for repetition, and for immediacy. And we see that ChatGPT may be particularly well suited to deliver those kinds of things. It's worth noting that these are almost the exact same readerly desires that the literary critic Mark McGurl talks about in relationship to the novel in the age of Amazon, specifically when he talks about Kindle Direct Publishing, this self-publishing platform that Amazon has. So KDP basically provides cheap, $1.99, $2.99 stories and like novels that are extremely niche and often quasi-pornographic, and they provide them at a rapid clip. And these are mostly underpaid writers, although a lot of writers on KDP are actually able to make a living, but they're only able to make a living when they churn out a lot of works that are often very specifically catered to what readers want and what they're willing to buy. So in many ways, ChatGPT resembles KDP, except human writers aren't paid at all. This broader insight about what users are actually asking for, we think is also important to remember for NLP research. So for example, we see a lot of NLP papers that will penalize models for things like predictability or cliche language, but sometimes this is what users are asking for. So we argue that LLM output quality should be considered within the context of users' requests, which often fall into genres where predictability is not necessarily a negative quality with things like fan fiction or erotica, and that prompts should be realistic, matching the level of detail and iteration that we observe in WildChat users. So let's take a look at some actual exchanges to get a better sense of what's happening with WildChat fiction. So here, a user prompts ChatGPT with a very detailed prompt for a Back to the Future-like story about two characters who want to change history, providing their names, brief backstories, and key plot developments. So the user says, make a story about Meredith Lexington, a news editor from Los Angeles, California, who wants to end her parents' forced marriage, and Andrew Bennett, a journalist from Brooklyn, New York, who wants to solve a murder mystery. They wanted to go back in time, so they changed history. And then skipping a little bit, Meredith bought a scarf from the market, then she wore it. Skipping to the bottom, Andrew discovers his father, Jeremy, was killer. Andrew and Meredith are developing feelings for one another. Add some dialogues. While the user provides a lot of detail here, this is 182 words long, much of the actual prose, the connective tissue, and literary language is left up to the model, and some elements are left entirely up to the model, like the dialogue. So the chatbot responds with a 679-word story, incorporating almost every detail mentioned by the user, including that scarf. So the model responds, Meredith tightly clutched the scarf she had just purchased from the bustling market in Los Angeles. As a news editor, she was constantly exposed to stories of heartbreak and injustice, but her own personal mission was to end her parents' forced marriage. Determined to find a way to change their fate, she wrapped the scarf around her neck, hoping for a spark of inspiration. So it continues on, and unlike the user's prompt, the LLM narrative shifts into free indirect discourse and omniscient narration, revealing and relating the character's thoughts and feelings, as well as the requested dialogue, including invented voice quivering and eyes narrowing. So walking through the hallways of Laurel Springs School, Meredith's heart skipped a beat when she saw a familiar face, her mother, but in her teenage years. And sort of skipping to the end, Meredith says, I know this may sound impossible, but I come from the future. I need to prevent your forced marriage, mother. It's tearing our family apart. So the chatbot story is melodramatic and cliche, both in specific turns of phrase and in the generic time travel trope. But that's pretty much exactly what the user asked for. The fulfillment of this trope in literary prose the user didn't actually craft themselves is likely enjoyable, however predictable, and still unexpected in its particular realization. Other users take an even stronger hand in fiction creation by providing part of an already written narrative or dialogue in a prompt style that we refer to as co-writing. For example, one user repeatedly begins a fanfiction narrative in the Doki Doki Literature Club universe based on the 2017 visual novel video game. In this user's story thread, one character, Natsuki, is often pregnant and unexpectedly goes into labor. So the user begins with a very long, this is excerpted, dramatic dialogue, and there are characters who are panicking, they're searching for a phone to call an ambulance, and it all leads to the main character's dialogue that gets cut off mid-sentence. So Natsuki says, my body, it's, and the chatbot picks up at this exact moment, my body, it's starting to push on its own. I can feel the baby coming. And then another character, Sayori, finds a phone and dials 911. I've called an ambulance, Natsuki, they're on their way. And at the end of the story, the paramedics arrive and they say, congratulations, Natsuki, it's a beautiful baby girl. So the model completes Natsuki's gridded exclamation and also picks up on Chekhov's gun-style details, like the characters were looking for a phone. This is the famous idea that, if there's a loaded gun at the beginning of the story, it's going to go off by the end of the story. So there are these little clues or hints that the model picks up on. And it's notable that this is a stereotypical happy ending with the birth of a beautiful baby girl. But that's only one of many endings to this story. This reader-writer started the same story, or a nearly identical one, more than 200 times in 8 months. Not unlike a child asking to be read the same picture book again and again, or a sci-fi buff seeking out another sci-fi novel. Except with LLM-generated stories, each ending is slightly different, the same but new. So recall the user who was asking for that Back to the Future style story about Meredith Lexington. That was not the user's only shot at that story either. They requested 33 nearly identical versions of the same Meredith Lexington story. in 4 sessions over a couple of weeks, often changing or adding small details. Sometimes having them give birth to a son named Peyton and then explaining their whole journey to the sun, and other times changing other small details. So this plot shows on the x-axis a particular date or day when this user had a conversation with ChatGPT that included fiction, and on the y-axis you can see the time of day that they were prompting. And so each conversation or each dot represents a particular conversation which might include multiple exchanges. So this story cycle is just a drop in the bucket compared to the user's fiction output overall. More than 600 conversations across 11 months. The genres are eclectic, alternative, Hollywood histories, fake news articles, fan fiction riffs, and original stories, many of them also anchored in time travel tropes. Even when the reader-writer ventures out to different prompts, they return to similar ideas and characters, such as Hollywood actor Matthew Broderick. Broderick shows up in more than 200 different prompts from this user. Sometimes he appears in fictionalized journalism. Make a fictional article about Matthew Broderick, who played Holden Caulfield in the film adaptation of Catcher in the Rye. And sometimes he surfaces as in original fiction as a long-lost father figure. Paige learned that Matthew Broderick, a well-known actor, was her father. What makes the archive especially striking is the way these obsessions are interleaved. So this is a zoomed-in version focusing around the time where the user starts prompting with the Meredith Lexington stories. So actually, the same night that they're prompting for Meredith Lexington, they actually begin by asking for a poem. So make a poem about blue skies resembled a diamond. And then close to midnight, they begin the first Meredith Lexington session, lasting almost an hour. The next morning, they pick up the same story cycle again. And then the next day after that, the next morning, they pivot into something completely different. A fake article about a real limited edition McDonald's Grimace shake that causes mass food poisoning and vomiting. And this is likely inspired by a real viral social media trend where people pretended to get food poisoning from the McDonald's Grimace shake. And they take it up again later that afternoon. So about a week later, the user tries their hand at fan fiction about the Korean drama Reply 1988. Then a couple of days later, they circle back to the Meredith Lexington stories. And then a couple of weeks later, it's back to Matthew Broderick again. So there's clear experimentation, but also rapid iterations around repeated characters and premises. Many of the prolific users in WildChat ask for the same kinds of fiction in a similar vein. So while the average user in the dataset employs repetitive or duplicative prompts, 17% of the time, the average power user produces 67% identical or duplicative prompts. And among the top 10 users, that amount soars to 92%. So prolific users achieve their high stats by inputting nearly identical variations of the same prompt again and again and again. So the prevalence of prompt duplication reveals a major affordance of LLMs for fiction generation. They can produce countless versions of the same story without getting tired. It should be acknowledged that we don't actually know why these users are repeating the same prompts over and over again. So I've been kind of framing this as if this is something that they actively want and that they find pleasurable, but it also might be possible that they are frustrated, that they're not getting exactly what they want, and that's why they keep iterating on the same prompts. And I think many of us, if you've had an interaction with an AI model, you've probably had an interaction where you're like, no, that's not what I want, and you're feeding it similar prompts over and over again. And this is one reason I think that future work, and this is work that we are interested in conducting, really needs to use more ethnographic approaches and actually talk to users about why they're generating fiction and what they're doing with it. But I will say that after reading through many of these conversations in detail, repetition does seem to be pleasurable, at least for some users. And this does track with other research about literature and culture. So again, there's the Mark McGurl take, where he says that genre fiction is sort of inherently repetitive. And this is a kind of central part of our life as readers that begins when we're children, and it can continue even into adulthood. There's other research, like studies conducted by Carl Berglund. He's analyzed a data set of real-world audiobook data from the platform Storytel, and he has mapped the users into 3 different categories, one of which is the repeaters. So these are people who listen to the same audiobook over and over and over again. So in one place, he describes these reader audiobook listener profiles and says, Reader A reads only books in the Little Beach Street Bakery series by the British romantic fiction writer Jenny Colgan. In fact, the first book in the series makes up over 95% of the user's total consumption. Another repeater, Reader B, reads even more and reads only Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy. The 3 books are repeated in order over and over again during days and nights for over 5 hours per day on average. So there is some evidence that this is a real phenomenon that I think we need to do more work to theorize and understand. So lastly, I just wanted to say a little bit about the 2 most prevalent categories that we see in the WildChat fiction, and that is fan fiction and erotica, which often overlap. So fan fiction is fiction about existing stories and fictional universes. It is extremely popular on websites like Archive of Our Own, otherwise known as AO3. There are millions of stories on AO3. Some of the most popular are things like the Harry Potter universe or the Marvel universe, Twilight universe. And it's likely the most popular form of amateur fiction on the internet or elsewhere today. So when we classify whether conversations contain fiction or not, we also classify whether they contain fan fiction and sexually explicit material. And we find, based on this classification, that fan fiction makes up 49% of the fictional conversations, which is extremely high. Sexually explicit material is included in 27% of the fiction conversations, at least based on our classification. This is a much blurrier category, and we also have lower precision and recall in this area. And this is something that is genuinely really difficult to classify. It often is very subjective and kind of exists on a spectrum. So that's something that we want to think more about. But this finding is corroborated by some of the classification work that was done by the original WildChat users. So they include as metadata in the WildChat data that they release a toxicity classification, which they did by drawing on 2 tools, Detoxify and the OpenAI moderation API. So if we look at those toxicity classifications, about 35% of our fiction subset have been labeled as toxic. And in their paper, they talk about how 88% of the toxicity is sexual. So those numbers kind of line up with what they're seeing. I don't have a ton more to say about the erotica. I'm going to talk a little bit about fan fiction and how it overlaps kind of with erotica and romance. But I just want to highlight again that this is a more detailed breakdown from the OpenAI report that came out last month. And again, erotica is strikingly absent from this analysis. So, where is that? Because we know that it's there. But I want to talk a little bit about the fan fiction. Why is fan fiction, sexually explicit fan fiction, and also other kinds of fan fiction, so popular among these WildChat users? I'll talk more about this in a second, but that was Sam Altman's announcement about erotica. So why is fan fiction so popular? Well, fan fiction may be prevalent simply because it's widespread on the web and just extremely popular in general. But one of the possible appeals of LLM-generated fan fiction for hungry readers is that it resembles the tagging systems found on popular fan fiction websites like AO3. But it provides even more granularity and customization. So these extensive tagging systems, which you can see here, this is an individual Harry Potter fan fiction story on AO3, and these are all of the extensive tags that are included with this story. So they enable readers to locate fiction that matches a precise set of desired features in a dense archive, like stories featuring a romantic relationship between Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter that also has specific elements like a slow build and enthusiastic snogging and sex in the Slytherin dormitory. LLMs potentially render this discovery task redundant, enabling readers to specify in natural language the exact story they want. So, for example, one user requested a scene from the Persona universe. This is a popular Japanese role-playing video game, and specified a particular relationship or ship between the characters Naoto and Kanji. So the user says, come up with a Persona 4 scene in which Naoto and Kanji reveal their evil, revealing Naoto as a sadistic, sensual, manipulative, sultry, cunning, self-centered, arrogant diva who's extremely romantic towards and extremely overprotective of Kanji, while revealing Kanji as a violent, sadistic, power-hungry, buff brute who is similarly extremely romantic towards and extremely overprotective of Naoto, and also giving them new outfits. This prompt is almost akin to a user searching a fanfiction website for Kanji Naoto stories, where the characters are evil, but the user can request even more specificity than tags provide, these counterfactual character traits, as well as superficial details like the new outfits. So in a 332-word response that resembles a screenplay, ChatGPT brings these requested character traits to fictional life, while also providing, and this is unspecified by the user, a setting, an extended cast, and a story that is coherent with the Persona 4 fictional universe. So it begins in interior, June's food court day. The investigation team had gathered at the food court. Suddenly, Kanji and Naoto walk in arm in arm. Everyone notices that they look extremely different, and there's a dark aura surrounding them. Kanji smirking, hey everybody, don't we make a great couple, me and Naoto? Naoto smiling wickedly, indeed. It's too bad that none of you could ever understand the depth of our connection. The shipping of these characters and their turn toward the dark side is almost comically on the nose. The characters announce out loud to the group that they are a couple, smiling wickedly in their dialogue tags. And yet the user prompt is pretty on the nose and over the top too. So in this sense, the story sort of nails the vibe. I think what's finally noteworthy, at least to me, about this LLM-generated scene is that ChatGPT is clearly familiar with the Persona 4 universe. The model correctly sets the scene in the headquarters of the video games world, the food court and the June's department store. Other members of the investigation team are also correctly named and included. This helps demonstrate the subtle way that LLM outputs, however simple or trite they may seem, on the surface, intricately remix and stitch together styles, tropes, archetypes, and canonical elements of existing creative works. In this case, the model draws on conventional screenplay formatting, tropes of Japanese role-playing game melodrama, character archetypes like the diva and the brute, and precise diegetic details from the Persona 4 universe. So what does all this mean for the future of fiction? WildChat offers a window into the potential development of a new kind of fiction and creative dynamic, one that several companies, including OpenAI, are already banking on. So one of them, the startup Character AI, a self-described AI entertainment company valued at more than $1 billion with more than 20 million monthly users, allows users to create and chat with customized fictional characters, to jump into stories and scenes, to role play, and a lot more. More than half of its users are reportedly Gen Z and Gen Alpha people. And this suggests that even if older generations don't understand the attraction, this kind of AI entertainment will likely have staying power. Other companies are getting into the game too. There's a self-publishing platform now called Inkit. This is similar to Wattpad, for those of you who are familiar with Wattpad. And they take the most popular stories on the free side of Inkit, and they port it over to the subscription app, Galatea. And then they use ghostwriters who use LLMs to generate a bunch of sequels and follow-ups to those stories. And they have ambitions of using AI to craft those stories even more specifically to readers' desires. And the CEO said, imagine if hundreds of thousands of authors could just spitball a few bullet points, and then that bullet point turns into a book, and then they write another bullet point, and that turns out another book, and then suddenly each author is writing 1,000 books. Google is getting into the game too. So Google now has this Gemini storybook app where you can give it a prompt and it will write a 10-page illustrated storybook based on your prompt in just a few minutes. So I asked it to write a story about a dragon at UC Berkeley, and it gave me the story about Barnaby in front of the clock tower. And this has a lot of children's book authors up in arms. But on the flip side, there are other people who say, I actually really like this tool. This allows me to write something very specific for my daughter who's nervous about going to school, and I can write this really specific thing for someone that I care about. And in addition to Sam Altman's announcement about erotica, so he announced this in a tweet. He said, we made ChatGPT pretty restrictive to make sure we were being careful with mental health issues. We realized this made it less useful / enjoyable to many users who had no mental health problems. But given the seriousness of the issue, we wanted to get this right. Now that we've been able to mitigate the serious mental health issues and have new tools, we're going to be able to safely relax the restrictions in most cases. And at the bottom here, he announces that in December, once they roll out age gating, they're going to introduce things like erotica for verified adults based on their treat adults like adults principle. That's one way that we see kind of OpenAI maybe responding to these developments. Another new development from OpenAI is the Sora 2 app. So this is their text to video model that is now a social media app that resembles TikTok. And I haven't gotten access to Sora 2, although if anybody has an access code, I would be open to an invite. But based on the reporting so far, some of the things people are saying that they're seeing look very similar to what we see in WildChat, for example. Lots and lots of fan fiction, like creating a video of Pokemon playing Zelda, or the Midsommar movie, except all the characters are replaced by SpongeBob characters, which I actually think is kind of hilarious. But this is getting OpenAI into a lot of hot water with Hollywood and with actors, and kind of into even more intellectual property trouble than they were in before. Sora 2 has also, I think, sparked kind of a big moral backlash. I think more than some of the other developments I've seen from OpenAI in the past. And I think they're kind of well summarized by this New York Times piece by a writer named Bobby Johnson. What is Sora slop for exactly? People are like, why did they create this? What is this even for? I think after seeing what we see in WildChat, it's less surprising to me that they would create something like this, because there clearly is a demand to create, fictional things with AI models. But people are really shook by this. So this writer in particular says, Sora is a ghoulish puppet show, and exploring it feels like wandering around an empty fun fair. Even when there is a semblance of genuine human interaction, it manages to be uncanny and disquieting. So Johnson is bringing up a dimension of AI art that many critics have also raised: the loss of human connection, the loss of connection with a human other in this artistic dynamic. And this really echoes sentiments like those from the author Ted Chiang in his now famous New Yorker essay, where he writes, whether you are creating a novel or a painting or a film, you are engaged in an act of communication between you and your audience. It's by living our lives in interaction with others that we bring meaning into the world. That is something that an autocomplete algorithm can never do, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The fundamental affinity between art and human connection is deeply felt for many creators, and I would say critics, and deeply felt by me as well. the implications of this new creative dynamic where an exchange between at least two human partners is being replaced by an exchange between a human and an AI other, like what this means, I think remains uncertain. And we have a lot to do to kind of theorize this and do more ethnographic work of talking to people and really try to understand what this means. So there's a lot more that I could say, and hopefully we can talk more about this at the workshop later for any of you who are going to be attending that as well. But I'll just close with a brief reflection. So combing through this real world data has made me see AI-generated fiction differently. It has made me see the powerful appeal it has for some people. It has made me think about the affinity between LLM outputs and fiction, that they go well together, and the enticing capacity for LLMs to produce never-ending stories. This is a real phenomenon that will inevitably shape the literary and cultural landscape, even for authors and creators who are going to be producing works in deliberate defiance. It seems unwise to look away. Thank you.
We're going to open the floor now for questions. Since we also have questions from people who are online, I'll be kind of interacting with that. So we'll probably take a question or two from the floor. Then there'll be a question from online. And then we'll do that dance. The microphones are a little bit finicky. And so when a person from the floor asks a question to the people online, you might have to repeat it, summarize it. It gives you a chance to change that question to one that, no, just kidding. So here we have a question here, and then we'll go there, and then I'll go online.
Thanks, it was super fascinating. I never heard of the WildChat dataset. Thanks for bringing this to our attention. I have 3 questions. I try to be really.
Okay.
First, what is the idea of fiction that you're using, which seems to be mostly the idea of the counterfactual? What is included there, what is not included, but it's fiction as a mode of discourse rather than a genre. What follows from that? Because I saw some things that I wouldn't call fiction, like a what if for a business plan doesn't seem to be fiction. The second question is about reception. You seem to make the assumption that people generate to read rather than generate to publish. And I wonder if you look into this, how much of the chats that you saw there end up on our own things, right? And regenerating, is that maybe writing? Of course, the collapse between reception and production is something that happens. And the third one that is something I'm really interested in is the question of style. What's kind of the generic style of fiction that comes out of this model? And what is it based on? Is it already based on the idea of the style of fan fiction, erotica? A lot of this, his voice quivering, has something of that feel. And if that is so, is there maybe a problem in the classifier also being there alone? Because it finds that type of fiction that it is mostly exposed to, and thus maybe steering away from a broader idea of fiction as genre versus fiction as it is in the mix.
Okay, I'll try to repeat those questions. So the first question is about how we're thinking about fiction. Kind of, you're making this point that we're talking about it as a discourse, as the counterfactual, rather than a genre. Yeah, I think, as I kind of alluded, what counts as fiction, that's like a whole very active area of literary studies. And it's really fascinating. And I think it's not something that we wanted to really delve into in a very nuanced way. So I think we intentionally were trying to cast a broad net to find, again, things beyond write a story about this or that. So we went broad, and I think I'm really glad that we did, because we found so many things that we wouldn't have expected to find. I think, it's a fair point that does pornography count as fiction? Does, some of these things world building, you mentioned what if some alternate scenario for a business plan. I haven't seen that.
Sorry, I thought I saw that on your slide. Was it a maybe I missed it.
Okay, but so yeah, I think there's more work that we could do to be more specific and think about it as a genre, but I think we intentionally went broad. Your second question was about, we're framing this as people are reading AI fiction, but what about people who are publishing this elsewhere or people who are writers? Again, I think that's something that I'm sort of doing intentionally to try to like divert attention from only writing to also thinking about reading and consumption and more kind of, passive like entertainment. I guess it's not passive because they're involved in the process, so it's blurry. And there are reports from like the archive of our own community that people are starting to post AI-generated fan fiction stories. And that community is very mad about that. So we do know that people are sometimes publishing those things elsewhere. This is why I really want to talk to users because I don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're sending this to like their friends and their partner, their family or something. And that would be really interesting to me. So we don't really know. And I think we're intentionally focusing on the reading side of it. But of course, there's blurriness, there are reader writers, and it's a really interesting area. I guess your last question was about style and kind of about are there complexities in using an LLM to classify this fiction based on like what it's trained on and the kind of style it's familiar with? I think that's an interesting question. I feel like the manual evaluation that I've done of the classification, it seems quite good. I mean, I haven't looked at the rest of WildChat, so we may be missing more than that. I think, it does seem complicated to be studying LLM-generated fiction with an LLM, although I think that's kind of, these are the methods that we're using these days, and the LLMs are really good at classifying texts. That's something that really came through in this project. So the style question is a good one. I would want to keep thinking about it more, and I'd love to hear your thoughts later.
Great. So why don't we just jump to the one that's online because it actually builds on these questions. Have you seen an example of people inputting other people's hobby writing, fan fiction, for example, and then asking the LLM to generate a story based off of the generated fan fiction story?
I have seen that. So I was going through the toxicity results, and I was also going through because we did one analysis where we tried to find anything where the guardrails were raised, where ChatGPT said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." A lot of times it's like the sexually explicit material where ChatGPT says, "No, I can't write that for you." But sometimes there are other things, and one of them I saw was somebody saying, "Respond to this fanfiction story," and then it was just like a Wattpad link, and then ChatGPT was like, "I'm sorry, I can't go to that link or whatever." So I have seen at least one example of people doing that, which makes me think there might be more of it.
Great. There was a question over here.
Related to that, actually, I wonder the extent to which the fact that it was sort of a layer on top of ChatGPT got a lower rate of fiction. Right, so character AI and replicating sort of other sources are out there marketing to we won't get you for erotica, or we will role play, whatnot. So I wonder if you're sort of underestimating in that. I mean, you're talking a little bit about the people who are sort of trying to jailbreak or get around it, but I wonder if you're also selecting the people who are willing to try to jailbreak, or who don't already pay for another service, or who don't spend months to figure out how to run local llama to get there. So I wonder if you're sort of underestimating on that front. And then the other interesting sort of market for this that I just discovered yesterday, so I guess I'll share, is a friend of mine recently had her cat pass away. And on Etsy, apparently, you can pay for a pet psychic to contact your cat in the afterlife and write you a very repetitive, emoji-filled LLM conversation with your deceased animal. And this seems like yet another, for some definition of fiction, 100% of that is fiction, right? And but this is selection, but rather you wouldn't get that here. And so as one sort of example of, how evenly or unevenly do we think fiction is distributed across different LLM platforms? I guess is my actual question that took too long to get to.
Wait, so can you say the part about the cat psychic again? You're saying that it wouldn't get picked up in this?
Well, it's a different, that person didn't use this service.
Oh, right.
Right, the same as the people on character AI are not using. Right, how much is this data set sort of one slice of where we might see more or less fiction in other LLM platforms?
Yeah, okay, so I think maybe a broad summary is like, how representative is like WildChat of things that we might see on other platforms, or like the kind of jailbreaking we see or the boundary pushing, is it unique to WildChat, or do we see it more broadly? I think there are definitely like limitations and like unique things about this community. So yeah, I think, you know, the original WildChat authors speculate about this as well. I mean, one, the fact that it's on Hugging Face Spaces probably means that maybe they're more like tech adjacent people, because somehow they're like aware that this exists. I've seen this, like the link to the WildChat bots on like Reddit and elsewhere. So I think like maybe there are other places where people might find their way to it, but it suggests that these are more online literate people. I also think, you know, the incentive I mentioned for people is that like they don't have to make an OpenAI account, so they can do things that wouldn't be traced back to them. So I think we do see a lot more intentional jailbreaking. I think we see people doing stuff, pushing boundaries that they wouldn't do even with their own like account. So yeah, I think this is a distorted representation of AI use. But again, it's like one of the only data sets that we have. So I still think it's really interesting to look at, and we can only sort of speculate about like, you know, if we might see it on other platforms. But yeah, I'm hopeful that maybe more of these kinds of data sets will be developed. But again, it's very ethically challenging to do this in a way that is like respectful to the users, preserves their privacy, but also represents like organic interactions.
Not as like a critique of like, oh, you're not representative, like totally not.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just saying it is like, I think it's an important question. Yeah.
We're going to pivot to this side of the room because I realized I was oriented this way and I missed all of the great questions.
I wonder why like AI generated like general like literature, like whether it's poetry or prose, like why is it sort of inclined in this way to write with these like very cliche formats? Is it the model providers like genuinely chose such literature to train their models, or is it that something happened during the RLHF process where the humans who were chosen to annotate the good prose or the good poems chose this sort of thing? Like, do you have any insight into what's the origin of the AI generated literature looking like the way it is?
Yeah, so the question is like, why are mainstream AI models, like why is their LLM literature so cliche? Is it the training data? Is it the reinforcement learning with human feedback? Is it something else? Yeah, I think it's probably both. I do feel like the reinforcement learning part of things, like the post-training stuff, I feel like some research has been showing, I think Ryan Huser has a piece about AI-generated poetry in Cultural Analytics that just came out. And I think he sort of speculates that it's this, it's that those extra steps where, yeah, people are saying, I like this response better. And that's one of the places where things are going much more cliche. Because yeah, people are probably getting, you know, poems or something of that vein where it's like, I like a rhyming poem. I like a simple poem, you know? So I think that is one of the, and I think there's also research that's been showing that when LLMs are fine-tuned on more like prestigious literary fiction, they can write things that look like prestigious literary fiction. So I think the models can do it. I feel like it is like the mainstream API or AI companies trying to cater to the common denominator through these like post-training steps. That's my kind of hypothesis.
I think kind of related to that, you did discuss how users might want stuff that is generic or repetitive, but a lot of scholars are sort of worried about what LLM generated text means for the diversity of either fiction or nonfiction that you might see. Like it might be less diverse in the claims it makes about the world or in its style of writing. And I wonder how you sort of reconcile those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, you know, like in some ways we see similar issues with human authored writing and like the publishing industry. Like we also see a lack of diversity in a lot of different ways, like racial, ethnic representation, as well as like diversity of styles and ideas, because the publishing industry, especially the big five, the mainstream publishers, they're trying to publish what sells. So we actually do have like similar problems, you know, outside of AI generated literature. So I kind of feel like it's an issue more broadly. I mean, I think it's kind of a product of like when capitalism like looms large over all of the culture industries, and it kind of, there's like this incentive to push it in this direction. But I mean, I guess I'm kind of worried in a way. But for me, the bigger questions are about this loss of human connection thing, like how this feels entirely different to the whole experience of writing, and that it's like could be so disconnected from someone's actual human experience. I mean, I'm definitely concerned about that. I'm just saying that it's not the only arena in which we're having problems with cultural materials being very narrow and undiverse.
Great. I think we actually are out of time, unfortunately, for this room, because we end at 1:30. Is that correct, Lily? Yes. So I know that Melanie will be more than happy to address questions offline. Yes.
True.
I like the way I said that declaratively. And I want to remind you that the Cultural Analytics Series continues this fall and also in the spring. Our next speaker will be Peter Dodds from Complexity Sciences at the University of Vermont, talking about narrative and archetypes. And you can find that information on the Cultural Analytics subsite on the BIDS website. Please register. There's something that is called an application. Those are just for us to keep track of who is coming to the different events that we have, the talk and the afternoon roundtable workshop. So I encourage you to fill those out so that we can keep track of who wants to come, and so that we can give you the information for those events. So Peter will be here in November, and then in the spring we have some events focused on both multimodal models for the study of culture, some work on music, and then also a really interesting former PhD student here from the iSchool, Kyle Booten, who's talking about some of his new work, which is hard to characterize in a single phrase, but should be very exciting. I want to thank Melanie again for taking the time to come down from Washington to enjoy our different weather and to engage with us here at Berkeley. I want to thank all of you for coming. I look forward to seeing you at more of these events. And I think we should thank Melanie one more time for coming.